Hello students, I am Mandeep Kaur. Today we are going to discuss the events of cardiac cycle. As you know, the cardiac cycle is equal to 1 diastole plus 1 systole. So we are going to discuss the different events of contraction and relaxation of atria and ventricles. In the first event, I have drawn outline diagrams of heart to understand the events better. So in the first event, so this is the outline diagram of heart. Left atrium, left ventricle, the mitral, right atrium, right ventricle, right wall, aorta, and pulmonary artery. So we will start with the contraction of atria, atrial contraction. So when the atria starts contracting, when the atrium starts contracting, pressure in the atrium will be higher than the pressure in the ventricle. When the atrium will start contracting, the pressure in the atrium will increase, will be higher than the pressure in the ventricle. So, in this condition, now the mitral valve will open. Mitral valve will open. Similarly, in the right side also, atrium starts contracting due to high pressure blood. Tricuspid valve will open and blood will start flowing from atrium to the ventricle. Similarly here, the blood will start flowing from atrium to the ventricle because of atrial contraction. So when the blood starts flowing from atrium to the ventricle, ventricle starts filling. One thing we must remember that ventricles are already filled about 80%. Even before atrial contraction, ventricles are already filled up to 80% that we will discuss in the upcoming events. So this is the first cardiac cycle in which the atrium starts contracting, the mitral valve will open. Similarly, in the right side also, tricuspid valve will open and the blood will flow from atrium to ventricle, and this stage is called stage of atrial contraction. So here we once again discuss this valve open, mitral and tricuspid valves are open. The semilunar valve of aorta and pulmonary artery, they are closed. Now moving on to the second, now what will happen? When the blood moves from atrium to the ventricle starts filling. When the ventricle is filled, pressure in the ventricle increases. So, when the blood is filled in the ventricle, slowly the pressure starts to build up in the ventricle. Now, the blood will try to go back to the atrium. And to stop that, mitral valve and tricuspid valve be closed. To stop the backflow of blood from ventricle to the atrium, these valves will be closed. And by the closure of mitral valve and tricuspid valve, first heart sound is produced. that is 1. So, the closure of mitral and tricuspid valves produces first heart sound, that is S1. Now, what is the condition here? Ventricles have been filled with blood. This mitral valve and tricuspid valves are closed, but the pressure in the ventricle has increased, but the pressure is not that much that it can open the semilunar valve. So, here the ventricles start contracting. Atria will now relax and the ventricles will start contracting. When the ventricles will contract, the pressure in the ventricles will be rising. Now, see this diagram carefully. In this diagram, what we see, this valve is closed, this valve is also closed, which means the ventricle is acting as a closed chamber. Ventricle is contracting, but it is not receiving blood from anywhere, it is not giving blood to anywhere. It is behaving as a closed chamber. So its volume is same. This stage is called isovolumetric contraction. So, in the first stage, atria will contract and the blood will be filled in ventricles. Then when the pressure will rise up, the blood will start to try to flow back. Then the mitral and tricuspid valve will close. By the closure of mitral and tricuspid valve, S1 heart sound will be produced. Now, the atria will relax and the ventricle will start contracting. When the ventricles are contracting, at this time the ventricles are behaving like a closed chamber because the blood is not entering in the ventricles and blood is not going out from the ventricles. So this stage is called isovolumetric contraction of what? Of ventricles. Now we will move on to the third stage. Now what will happen? When the ventricles are contracting rapidly, slowly the pressure will come higher and higher in the ventricle. Here comes a stage when pressure in ventricle will be higher than the pressure in aorta and pulmonary artery. When this will happen, blood will be pushed the aorta and pulmonary artery, and because of that semilunar valves will open. So the pressure has increased in the ventricles. Because of high pressure, semilunar valves open. In this condition, these valves are closed. The valves between atria and ventricles, these valves are closed. Now the atria, what is atria doing? Atria is receiving blood. It is acting as a tank or reservoir and it is receiving blood. It is getting filled with blood. These valves are closed. So the blood is not moving from atria to the ventricles. At this point, when the pressure in ventricles increase, semilunar valves will open and the blood will start flowing from ventricles to aorta, from left ventricle to aorta and from right ventricle to pulmonary artery. In this, ventricles are contracting rapidly. they are ejecting blood into these tubes. This phase is called rapid ejection. Rapid ejection phase. So after rapid ventricular ejection, now the next stage is almost the same. In this also, ventricles are ejected, but now the ejection has slowed down. It is not as rapid as it was there. So now there is slow ejection. So this stage is called slow ventricular ejection. In this, the ventricles are still ejecting blood into the tubes, but this slow ejection. The speed, the intensity has slowed down. So that is slow ventricular. Now, what will happen next? Now, the ventricles were contracting throughout. Now, the ventricles will relax. When the ventricles eject blood into tubes, into the pulmonary artery and aorta, when the ventricles will eject blood into these tubes, the pressure in these tubes will build up. So, when the pressure in these tubes will increase, the blood will try to go back to the ventricle. Now, when the blood tries to flow back, which valves will close? These semilunar valves will close. These semilunar valves will close. When these semilunar valves are closed, then second heart sound is produced, that is S2. Now in this stage, as you see the diagram, the ventricles has ejected their blood, most of the blood. They are not that much filled. Some volume of blood is remaining in the ventricles. Now the ventricles will relax, contract now. This is the relaxation stage of ventricles. In this stage also, as you can see that this valve is closed, similarly this valve is also closed. So ventricles are behaving like a closed chamber once again. They are not receiving the blood, they are not giving the blood away. So this stage is also isovolumetric, and this is called isovolumetric relaxation. So the name of this stage is isovolumetric relaxation. Isovolumetric relaxation. Moving on to the last stage. Now, as we have seen, in this stage, there is still some volume of blood left in the ventricles. This is called end systolic volume. This end systolic volume of blood. Now, the ventricles relax. This stage here, all the valves are closed, the ventricles are relaxing. Now, what will happen? As I have told you earlier, that the atria, both the atria are still receiving the blood. Both the atria are receiving the blood. So, they are getting filled. They are acting as a tank and they are getting filled with blood. Now, the pressure in atria is increasing because they are receiving the blood. At the same time, because ventricles have pumped all the blood in tubes, now ventricles have been relaxing, so the pressure in ventricles goes down. Now what will happen? The pressure in atria higher than the pressure in ventricles. Now what will happen? These valves will open again. mitral and tricuspid valve will open because the pressure in the atrium is much higher than the pressure in the ventricles. Now the blood will start moving from atria to the ventricles, but one thing is to be remembered that atria has not started contracting yet. The blood is getting filled into the ventricles passively. Atria is not contracting and squeezing out the blood, but the blood is getting filled passively into the ventricles. So, this will fill the ventricles up to 80%. It is called passive ventricular filling. Passive ventricular filling. I have told you this when I started with the first stage that the ventricles are almost 80% full when atria starts contracting. So, this is the last stage of cardiac cycle, which is called rapid passive ventricular filling. This is rapid passive ventricular filling. After this, when passively the blood flows from atria to the ventricles, after that atria will have to contract to squeeze out the remaining blood into the ventricles. That is atrial contraction once again. So these are the events of cardiac cycle. Thank you.